All right, we'll get started. So joining us today is Josh Crossney. He's the CEO and founder of the Cannabis Science Conference and Events, and I'm excited to have you on today, Josh. The conference you've been holding, I think one of the original, definitely one of the biggest science conference, was 2016 the first year that you guys did the conference?
Yep, we launched it in 2016 in Portland, Oregon, actually at the Red Lion on the river, if you're familiar.
Yeah, we got started at the end of 2015. I think the first one I went to might have been the 2017 one.
Yep, that was the first year we moved to the Oregon Convention Center.
That's what it was. Yep, and that's where I was at. Wow, 2016, a lot of years when you factor in the cannabis industry, time that's passed. So if listeners don't know, the Cannabis Science Conference is the world's largest and most technical, scientific, and medical cannabis event. They pull together cannabis industry experts, instrument manufacturers, testing labs, research scientists, and medical practitioners looking at science and technology of cannabis as it evolves. And I'm excited to have this conversation today. I think we initially met, it was at that conference, 2017, and I think that was the year we started the podcast, and we talked about having you on. So finally, one day, if you stick around long enough, eventually I think you meet everybody in this industry at some point. So excited to have you on. And I thought to start, I wanted to go over, because you've been a part of the industry for so long, I think the evolution and kind of progression of some of these different categories, specifically the tracks you guys focus on and how you kind of break up that conference. So we'll look at the analytical side, labs, the science around that, medical cannabis, cultivation, hemp CBD side, and then psychedelics, which I saw added this year. Is this the first year you've focused on that category?
Yeah, this is the first year that we added the psychedelic track, and we did it for the very first time at our West Coast show that we actually hosted in Long Beach, California this past May, and with great reception. So we're really excited about the psychedelic track for Baltimore, and I'm really excited to join you, Wayne, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to look at the psychedelic side too. That's it feels like cannabis kind of all over again. Something so brand new, nothing's established for it, so that'll be a fun one to dive into. I thought to start, and I'm kind of curious about this. So starting this conference in 2016, starting a conference at any time is a huge undertaking, let alone in cannabis 2016. What was the springboard or the thought of, getting into this side of the industry, starting a conference? I mean, that's a huge undertaking, especially back then. What was that first conference in early days like of setting this up?
Yeah, so, before I got into doing this and launching the conference, I was actually working in staffing and recruiting for the analytical science industry. So nothing to do with cannabis, but, a lot of the same companies you see as far as the instrument manufacturers, placing people in government labs, food safety labs, anything to do with analytical science. So I had noticed that a couple of the larger vendors had started to kind of quietly work with cannabis labs to provide instrumentation. And for me, being a friend of the plant myself, really most of my life that I can remember, cannabis has been a part of my life. But the only thing that's really changed is my education and knowledge of why I use it and how it does what it does. So, when I was younger, it was more of I'm smoking weed. Now it's like, okay, I'm using that because I have anxiety. It's really helped me with that. And, I'd rather use cannabis than other prescription medications for the same ailments. But, for me, I was really excited by the idea of having a chance to maybe get into the cannabis industry. Because like I said, it being such a big part of my life for so long, I had never really thought about it like that. You know what I mean? Until you start seeing these things. And this is 2014 going into 2015. And I'm at the time based in Baltimore on the East Coast. So back in those days, it was kind of like everything happening for you guys out in Portland and California and all over the West Coast really felt like a different country. You know what I mean? It's like none of that stuff was really happening here. We were talking about, potentially doing medical programs, things like that, but nothing was enacted. So in the beginning, I really, wanted to examine the industry and see what was not already being done and what was needed in the industry. So I did take a little time and I traveled around to some other conferences and trade shows, met with some people that were on the ground in the industry, and realized really quickly that most of the events that existed at that time, although they were doing a great job, most of them focused primarily on the business of cannabis. And, a lot of them are still around and are still doing a great job and dominating that space. But, for me, I was looking at it from an angle of a federally illegal industry. The science and the research is what's going to push us forward. So the fact that there was no real platform to lift up the researchers and the medical professionals and, even the cultivators and people that were on the ground doing this work and research. And then the other thing that really kind of piqued my interest and really troubled my, thoughts a little bit was, I connected with a few pediatric families that were dealing with pediatric illness like cancer and other things. And, one in particular, Tracy Ryan and her daughter, Sophie Ryan, when I first connected with Tracy and learned about her story and how Sophie was diagnosed with cancer at 8 months old, and that cannabis was part of her journey from that point, I, even as open-minded as I was and, a user of cannabis for so long, again, I was just starting to look into it, thinking about, babies that are like 8, 9 months old using it. I was like, wait a minute. Like, I took a moment of pause to be like, what do you mean? Like, are they rolling it up? Like, what is even happening, with kids? So obviously I know a lot more now than I know then. But, for me, I was like, if I had that moment of pause, there's a lot more people out there that aren't as open-minded as I am that'll have much longer pause on something like that. So I felt the need to, that's one of the biggest things I do other than the conference is advocate for pediatrics. And I work with a lot of the different nonprofits. But I learned at that time, they were based in California, that California did not require cannabis testing for quality control. And although some, brands were out there obviously doing it above and beyond what was required, but the fact of, like I said, connecting with, families that were treating children as young as 1 year old or even younger, with this plant. And, this plant is a miraculous, thing that is, a natural commodity that we should definitely be using and as medicine and also in other ways in this world. But, and cannabis in itself is inherently safe, and no one's ever died as a direct overdose of cannabis. But that doesn't mean that, especially when you're talking about immunocompromised populations, that things like contamination and potency, screening are not very, very important. So if you have mold or heavy metals or pesticides present in a cannabis sample that's being used by a sick patient that's immunocompromised, the cannabis would not be, harming them, but potentially those contaminants, especially if you're putting it through an extraction process, which is obviously what most of the, pediatrics are using. Yeah. So that paired with the fact, like I said, that there was, coming from that quality control analytical space that I was working in, and knowing that, just about everything in this world that comes in contact with humans is tested for quality control. And just thinking like, wow, this has been considered a medicine in California since 1996, and it's not even required. So I just kind of saw the need right there. Like, there was kind of like, flash, 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 like, you've got to highlight the science. You have to create this platform and bring the people together so we can advance this conversation and bring cannabis science to the forefront, and not just to the forefront, but also bridge the gaps between traditional science and medicine and the cannabis community.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially early on. It's funny to think now that even in California, there wasn't those testing requirements, and it wasn't required for the regulations there. Now it just seems like so obvious that for a state not to have some kind of, but that was it's not that long ago. And especially for pediatrics, kids getting involved or potentially being able to use it, or people with immune systems that are compromised, was early on. So it sounds like your skill set, there was that overlap. You saw some of the companies, labs, and providers. Was there not maybe hesitancy, but was it hard to get attendees and a following? Because early on, when it was just the business side, people are wanting to sell. The science side was like, they almost don't bring that into the industry because the regulators are then going to jump on it and want to over-regulate us. Did you face any of that kind of resistance?
Yeah, for me, it was like, it's a first rodeo. Like, whenever you're starting something, you never really know. So it actually, to my surprise and like pleasant surprise, it was the complete opposite. You know what I mean? Like, we started in Portland, and I know you're based in Portland, right, Wayne?
Yep.
Okay, so you'll probably know the lingo. So we were going to originally hold the conference at a small university. I can't remember the name of the university. They had a little event space. University Place was like the address of it. I can't remember exactly what, but it was this little event space. It would have maybe been like 10 vendors and like 100 people we could accommodate. And like, we outgrew that within like a month of launching the event. And that was so in 2015. So then we moved to another venue kind of in the interim where we kind of doubled. We could have had maybe 300 to 400 people and maybe 20 vendors. And again, we kind of plateaued and we were still 6 months out. So I was kind of like, thankfully, I'm glad I did and didn't just say, the work's done, sit back and relax. We did what we wanted to do. We grew with that interest. You know what I mean? So when we saw the interest was there, we adapted. And then that third time we had to move which is where we finally ended up at the Red Lion Hotel, where we ended up with 800 attendees and 75 vendors at the very first edition of the show. So, like you said, you're not talking about like the big business show of the year. You're talking about science. And in that first show, we mostly focused on just the analytical science and then had some medical information also throughout the day. But it was just one track. So you're talking about like creating something new and bringing that targeted of a segment of the community together. It was just, like I said, I was almost shocked. I was just like, great. But like I said, we grew with that as it was coming in. And after that first show, if you've been to the Red Lion, 800 people in the ballroom there, in the exhibit hall, it was just like, we knew that if we were going to grow even a little bit, we had to move it to the convention center. So that was really a cool feeling to, come out the gate, to go from like what you thought was going to be 10 vendors and 100 people to like you're booking the Oregon Convention Center once you're finished here. You know what I mean? So that was really cool.
Yeah. You got something when the natural demand like that is just there and it's bigger than you thought it was going to be. That's a huge motivator. Keep going.
And then, the show just kind of continued to like almost double each year. We were in Portland, like I said, 2016, and then 17, 18, 19, we were at the Oregon Convention Center. And then unfortunately, COVID came for us in 2020, which was terrible. And we're still, all of us trying to like, move on with our lives while also, being cautious and understanding that. But especially the events industry was hit very hard. So it's really great that our industry, although our industry did not stop because cannabis was deemed as an essential to our country. So I think that was amazing to see all over the country. But for the events, it just wasn't happening. So a lot of people went, virtual and did everything. So our show is very much about in-personal relationships. And, I take a very hands-on approach to what we do. And, you'll find me at the show taking this speaker over to this person and say, oh, you're doing this, they're doing that. You guys should be collaborating on research or collaborating on this business idea. And there's so many great connections that happen like that at the shows. So for me, it was just like the investment of time and money into like switching everything into a virtual platform. For me on the back end, the return that like things like this, having a one-on-one conversation where you're putting it out like as a podcast to your audience, like that's great. There's always going to be, people interested in that. But when you're taking an entire, 3-day conference and a huge exhibit hall with these avatars and people are walking around in a time where people are already at work on Zoom all day because of the pandemic, it just, for us, we took that little bit of a break. And it was, hard for us because that year, 2019 was our best year ever. So in the interim of those years in Oregon, after the 2018 show, we had felt that the East Coast had developed enough. And we were like, hey, let's bring this platform back home. Because like I said in the beginning of this conversation, we knew we had to take it out west because there was no market. But there really was like a medical cannabis revolution that started on the East Coast. So, that was great. And, our first edition in Baltimore in 2019 had about 1,500 attendees and about 100 vendors. So like for us, like coming out the gate with that in my hometown was, just amazing. And then, obviously, like I said, 2020 happened and then we were able to get a East Coast version out in 2021 in September, which was great. Even in September of 2021, where times were still a little unsure. We ended up with about 1,000, a little over 1,000 people, and I think about 80, 85 vendors. And then we were going to be doing our our West Coast show in February, but then in the interim between September and February is when the Omicron had really spiked up, and then we had to push our West Coast Long Beach show to May. So then, before we knew it, we had September rolling up on us again, as is less than a month away.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that was interesting. I think at first a lot of people thought, well, if we go virtual, it's way more accessible to way more people. But I think exactly what you pointed out, people are on Zoom all day. And the biggest thing of showing up in person is like the networking capabilities of it. And you just can't recreate that piece virtually. There's not those chance circumstance encounters.
Right.
And nowadays, I mean, if you really want to, if you're interested about a specific topic, you can sit on YouTube and watch all the talks and all the things that you want to. So.
Well, and then, the thing I kind of thought, because, obviously I talked to a lot of people about it. I talked to some of our vendors that were doing some of the virtual events. And, although I think it was great for content sharing, you know what I mean? Like some people are, and, oh, this speaker I love is going to be there. Yeah, I'll go and register. But people weren't spending the time on the exhibit floor, like you said, the networking. And, when you have vendors and a lot of these people were charging the same price that they charge for an in-person conference to have a table or a sponsorship for a virtual event. And, from a lot of the feedback I got, there just wasn't the engagement with the vendors. And, we're all about the education. Like you said, we're up to 5 tracks of education now. We're just like crazy with education that we just keep adding it, but we love it. And, that's our primary focus. But at the end of the day, your vendors, your supporters, and your sponsors, those are the ones that help you, enable you to do the education. You know what I mean? So like I said, I just didn't want to gamble with my relationships and say, hey, I'm going to, encourage you guys to sign up with us for this virtual show. And then it doesn't go great. And then once you're back to real life, it's like, oh, well, I did that virtual thing with you and it, wasn't that great. I really didn't get any leads. You know what I mean? So like I said, we were happy to take that break, but we were very close. We almost pulled the trigger on something, but then, there's last minute when your own inclination is like, no, don't do it. So I was just like, no, I'm not going to do it.
And I would imagine for most conferences, I mean, the vendors are probably the lifeblood as far as like cash flow. It's the oxygen that keeps everything and supports everything else. So if they don't have a good experience, that can completely ruin the future of a conference or an event like that. Let's look at kind of the analytical side and the labs, and we'll kind of move through the different tracks that you guys cover. And I think might work well to kind of do a past, present, future, what you saw initially, where we're at now, and then, where we still need to get to as the evolution of this industry is not slowing down anytime soon. So starting on the lab side, the analytical side, you said early on, there wasn't even the requirement for lab testing. And then now it was 2019, you went to Baltimore. Only 3 years later, when you couldn't even have done it there, then you have 1,500 attendees. Clearly, that has accelerated so quickly. New states come online. They're all putting in some kind of testing regulations, rules. Did you see like a specific tip? Was it the transition to rec that really triggered actual lab compliance to be required? Or was it something else when pesticides, heavy metals, testing for that stuff actually became a priority?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of kind of everything you said. You know what I mean? I think that the adult use program, obviously a lot more people are going to be participating in that in a state than a medical program. Yeah. And I think that, really, California started with medical, and it just was, kind of, once they passed that, it was kind of just like left alone for a while. It was kind of like, okay, we've got this through. You have it now. Do what you do. But I think a lot of the other states, when they started coming on, kind of saw the need to obviously do this, you know what I mean? Especially once you're getting, government agencies involved, obviously to form these commissions or programs, different states call them different things. It's great to see collaboration between the programs. You don't always see that, but I think that, if you're a state that had a medical program, and you've already went through it, and then there's a state next to you or even across the country from you that's doing the same thing, I think keeping those lines of communication open, saying like, hey, like, what have been some of the pain points that you've experienced? And like, what are some of the stuff that you did maybe that you wouldn't do again, that you would maybe do differently? And, just like, there's competition inside the industry, there can also be competition within, the regulatory side of things, and like which program kind of is the quote unquote, best program. But I think that, and then again, like I like to think that we've played at least a small part in that as well. Because, we've been out there and bringing these people together and lifting up those people and having their voices be projected. Because like I said, before we were out there, the people that were running labs, the people making the instrumentation, the people doing research, they weren't really out there being, highlighted. You know what I mean? Like, webinars, things like that. But it's like, there just wasn't a full conference. So, one thing I'm really excited about for Baltimore is we actually have a panel that's going to be the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, the New York State program, as well as Michigan's program. So all the testing people that are running the testing programs in those markets are going to come together. And that's exactly what they're going to talk about is the wins and the painfalls of, what it's been like and what the future's like. And, a lot of people are really interested in, in these states like New York, and now Maryland is looking to, is obviously adding this to the ballot for adult use in November. Like, what is going to happen? You know what I mean? Like, are these programs still going to be run by the same people? Are they going to be in somewhere else? Are they going to maintain, the medical program, but then the adult program will be separate? That is something that's also really, I talked a lot about pediatrics already, but as far as like the national conversation or federal conversation, Obviously my first thing is we need to deschedule and decriminalize cannabis completely. But when it comes to legalizing cannabis, I'm both for medical legalization on a federal level and also adult use at a federal level. My fear is that we will go only one way or the other, and it will dramatically affect the other population. So for me, if this is regulated like alcohol at a federal level and there is no medical program, I think about the 8-month-old children, the 2-year-old children that are using this as medicine. They're obviously not going to be able to roll into like a weed liquor store and get medicine. And it's not going to be the same quality of medical product that is, tested stringently and, formulated specifically for what they're trying to treat. Because one thing that makes cannabis, I think, so unique as compared to the big pharma industry is that cannabis is not the one size fits all pill model. Like cannabis, as you change one cannabinoid, difference in a cannabinoid profile or strain, it's really a different medicine at that point. So, we have Dr. Dedi Miri from the Technion Institute in Israel, who's going to be our plenary speaker. And his talk is going to be about just that, like figuring out what strains or which cannabinoid profiles, because I kind of hate the word strain, honestly, but cannabinoid profiles, work with different conditions, better, like which, compound makeup of cannabis works best for this type of breast cancer or that type of pancreas cancer. So it's really, his talk is actually called Matching the Right Flower to the Right Bride. So I think that's kind of a cool, play on word. But, precision medicine, like we have the opportunity to do this. And, we used to, look at personalized medicine even in healthcare, but we've kind of gotten away from that because the one size fits all is a more profitable model at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it's the system that's already in place, and I'm really worried about the same thing, and I hope it doesn't happen, but it feels more and more like the medical side will be kind of left to the wayside. And the concern is even if the science continues to evolve and a parent wants to take that into their own hand, I mean, a mother could go to jail if she decides to step outside the line and provide this to her son and daughter that is actually being benefited from it if there's not a system in place.
Yeah, I mean, there are still parents that are, getting put in jail sometimes, even in legal states. CPS is getting involved and going to the kids' schools and, talking to the teacher, you know what I mean? So it's just like, a family that's already going through something so terrible, and then you have to bring that into it. But it's mind you, if the kid's on cancer and they're already on chemo and, opiates and any of these other medications, it's that's fine. They can go to school, doped out of their mind on all these other things. But, if it's the cannabis, it's this big conversation. So, you being in Portland, I have always felt that Portland is like a second home to me because when we came there in 2016, the community embraced us and I spent so much time there over the years. And, it was really sad for us because we saw while we were there, really that happened in Portland. You're talking about 2015 to now, what it's done, what the medical program in Portland has went through over that time is really sad. And, I have a lot of friends that were operators in the medical side. I have a lot of patients I knew that I was friends with that were on the medical side. And, eventually it all goes over to the adult use side because, obviously there's more revenue to be made on that and things like that. But, I always liken it back to 1996 in California. We talk about medical here, adult use there, Canada, Colombia, Australia, all these other places, besides Israel, because that's what the research has been happening there forever. What happened in 1996, due to the efforts of Dennis Perone, others like him that were advocating for this as a medicine for the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And also, there were cancer patients that were part of that were advocating as well. It was a big movement. If it wasn't for those people and those medical patients, we wouldn't not only have that in California, but we wouldn't have any of the stuff I just said, not just here, but across the world. Because what happened in California in 96 really sparked that flame, no pun intended, of that movement. You know what I mean? It took a little bit of time, but that happening here in California, because when Prohibition happened and reefer madness happened, the rest of the world followed our lead on that, unfortunately. Yeah. So, it's we were able, it wasn't just us they brainwashed, those, 5 men, Anslinger, Hearst, DuPont, Mellon, I feel like I left one out, but that's not important. But it was a worldwide thing, so I always say that we cannot, as a community, forget about those patients and leave the patients behind when without the patients advocating, we wouldn't have what we have today.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I hope government agency, it seems like, I mean, it's harder for the businesses. I mean, some will stand up and want that, but the government agencies really got to put something in place because they create the system. They decide on those settings, and that's really what influences all the back end of the industry is the rules they put in place.
Well, I can tell you that, just from being on the ground, there's some great organizations like Americans for Safe Access and others. But, other than the few out there, there's not a lot of lobbying being done on the medical side of things.
Yeah.
So like I said, ASA and other organizations that are patient focused like that are out there and, feel the same way that we feel. But, at the end of the day, the almighty dollar rules the world. So, the majority of people lobbying, for brands, in DC is for adult use. So I always say, if you're a patient or if you love a patient and, this conversation is important, get involved, contact groups like ASA, they do lobby days where you can actually go and, talk to them, not just about legalizing it for everyone, which I agree with. And you can do that, but have a medical program that lives beside it. So people can opt into that and have different, grades of medical products and different kinds of access and different maybe tax situations. Yeah. Maybe it's covered by their insurance. You know what I mean? Imagine that, if it's federally legal. So, it's an important conversation. And some people think if you, say that you want the medical on the federal level, that you don't want the other. And I'm like, I want both, but both can exist, separately from each other.
Right. Yeah. Almost like I wonder if a hybrid system, because a few simple rules feel like it would really help the medical patients. Like the federal, they're going to put a big sales tax on it. Medical patient doesn't have to pay that. That brings costs down.
Right.
Maybe they can buy directly from a grower they work with, because then you're getting wholesale value. There's a couple of simple things, and that grower can still be adult use. And, so all those businesses still can align and, be financially profitable on that side at the same time. Do you see with labs and kind of this, is this the first time the different government agencies have come together? I was going to ask if you get regulators and government agencies there. I wonder about the standard once interstate commerce becomes a thing, because testing standards are going to have to line up.
Right.
Is having these groups have a panel, is that kind of the first time that's happened? And do you see a standard somehow emerging, or is that going to be chaos and a lot of infighting and take a decade? Because interstate commerce to me seems like it'll be legalized federally and then maybe another 20 years until all the states are actually trading with you. It seems like it could end up taking forever.
Yeah, so it's not the first time. We've definitely worked with regulators and brought them together and crafted panels both on the East and West Coast. It's interesting. We actually brought some of the Maryland people out to Portland to participate on a panel with some others, really knowing in 2018 when we brought them that we were planning to launch in Baltimore. So we were like, let's get them out there so they can see the show and see how great it is. And then that was great because they were really happy to help support the show and, get the word out and things like that. But you have a great point there. And it's not just the testing. It's like on a federal level, if this switches to federally legal, because we have, each state has different laws and regulations regarding cannabis. Once this is federally legal, it will be one set of laws and regulations. And it's just interesting to think about, like you said, what will that do to the entire industry to then have to just flip a switch on their model to be under the same umbrella and operating under the same rules and regulations as everyone in the entire country. So that was kind of like, circling back to what I was saying before, if like states could learn from each other and try to like make these programs similar, but fix the things that were wrong along the way. And I've said the whole time, instead of infighting and, it's all about, competition and success and money, which it is, everybody wants to make money. Everybody wants to be successful. But it's like, since we're federally illegal, and this is something that obviously definitely at some point will happen. I really truly feel that. Like, I don't know how soon, but I do feel that we will see federal legalization. But for something that's not federally legal, as an industry and a community, we should be working together to amplify each other's voices and show that actually we know what we're talking about and that we could be able to self-regulate. Because the more we can self-regulate now and show the federal government, because that's one of the reasons I can guarantee you that they're like kind of hesitant on doing this, because they're probably like, what the heck are we going to do with it? It's like, say we legalize it and then we got to like, they don't know what they're doing. They've been kind of like, holding the cross up to us this whole time. So, if we could self-regulate and work with them and show them, because if not, it's going to be over-regulated and it's not going to make sense. And it could completely turn this industry upside down on its head. And, some of the biggest players you see in this industry, they've invested so much money in being in multiple states and operating completely differently in multiple states because it's not the same rules and regulations,
Right.
that even just trying to switch all those businesses to one, model, which might not match any of their models. You know what I mean? So it's
So they might
it's
fight against
interesting
it.
to think about. And I say, other than the criminalization part, for me, I mean, I'm kind of like, let's keep doing what we're doing, decriminalize it, schedule it. And, the states obviously are going the way that we want them to go.
Yeah.
So I feel like if they made it that kind of conversation, that it would continue down that path.
It'd probably be faster if the federal government just took a hand, like opened it up legally, and then let the states figure it out intermingly. It'll kind of naturally evolve that way versus coming through with either an over-regulation. If they put down too many rules, it kind of always turns into an oligarchy. It feels like there's
Right.
4 or 5
Yeah.
big players. And I've wondered, from the business side with labs, one thing like with growers in all these states, they're setting up, in every state because that's the only way you can sell there. But like I grew up in Michigan. We don't grow oranges in Michigan. You grow them in Florida, and we buy them from
Right.
Florida. I wonder the same thing with labs. If, they're setting up individually in every state, if once it goes federal, a non-cannabis lab company that's already global potentially, but at least across the country, will step in, offer all these services. And a lot of these labs that are cannabis specific are actually going to be their whole business could be at risk of a much bigger player that's already ready to go. Because, the standards are set. They can add these testings. They have all the equipment. A lot of the stuff's already there. It's just some extra services and things they got to do testing for.
Yeah, and you're not wrong, because like you said, it's the same equipment. It's really the same instrumentation. And like what you were saying before, it's like, the big, 4 or 5 guys, if this goes that way, it's like, you think about cigarettes, it's like Marlboro, Newport, Camel. I mean, like, can you name more than 6 cigarette brands? You know what I mean? It's like, those are the ones that stick out in your mind. So unfortunately, I would not want to see it go to that, because, there's obviously commercial cannabis, but there's also craft cannabis. I know a lot of craft cannabis producers, and there is a difference. You know what I mean? There's definitely a difference in the quality of the products. But no, I think that could definitely be a possibility. You know what I mean? We do our Canna Boot Camp as our pre-conference workshop. And it's basically like a full day where attendees come and they rotate through zones. And we usually host it at a cultivation and processing facility. But then we also have our top vendors come in and set up and do kind of workshops on cannabis testing, sample preparation, and then obviously, like I said, the extraction is built in. But it's really a full day where you can go through the cultivation portion of the facility, go through the extraction portion of the facility, sit through the testing talk workshop, sit through the sample preparation workshop, and even like laboratory information management system workshop. And then you really do have a full idea of how the industry works from seed to sale.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, like you said, it's the same equipment, same instruments. So that's been a great event for like the analytical professionals that know the instrumentation and analytical science like the back of their hand, but they're like, I don't have any idea how any of what I know is being applied to cannabis. So they can come through and kind of walk through and be like, okay, in one day, okay, I get it now, because they understand it already. Mm-hmm. They just don't understand the applications with cannabis.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. That Canna Boot Camp, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, I'll put this in the intro, but the Baltimore conference is September 14th to 16th. So that's coming up soon. We'll probably get this out next week so people hear it ahead of time. But yeah, that's interesting to see how all these standards and states are going to merge. And it just feels like even after it's legalized, it's still going to take so long to get all those pieces to align. The Canna Boot Camp is cool. So that is on-site. You go to an actual processing facility or a cultivation site in Baltimore. What if, East Coast versus West Coast? Do you see the East Coast? Because at first it felt like a lot of the East Coast was coming from a place of fear with their regulations and over-regulated. Do you see that calming down a little bit and kind of starting to look more like the West Coast, where it's a little more just liberal, easier? I mean, I always think of, do you have to have $10 million to have a cannabis company, or can you start it with $100,000 or something, much more accessible to a lot more people?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of places that are trying to do good work as far as like social equity, and, working and reaching out to the communities that have been, negatively affected by the war on drugs, and, situations where it's beneficial if you've had nonviolent cannabis charges. And I think that's great. And I'd like to see more of that. But unfortunately, more times than not, it is the latter of, the hundreds of thousands of dollars and the who's who that you know or you don't know. So unfortunately, it is a really tough thing to get into if you're looking to be a licensed either retailer or, processor or even cultivator. But one thing I always say to people is, really like I said before, I took the time to travel around the industry and see what was missing and then see what I internally in my skill set could offer to the industry. So I definitely advise anyone to do that versus saying like, oh, I want to get in the cannabis industry, so I'm going to start a grow or I'm going to try to own a dispensary. And I always say to that is, if you're not a cultivator or horticulturalist now, maybe owning a grow isn't the best thing for you because you don't know that industry at all. And guess what? If you don't know retail, if you never worked or ran or owned a retail store, maybe owning a dispensary isn't the best thing for you. And there's so many different avenues to get into this industry where you don't have to spend the hundreds of $1,000s just to take a chance to apply, that you can. So, I've, carved out a pretty decent career for myself in this industry. Self-funded everything, from the beginning. And, I'm happy with the path that I took. You know what I mean? I couldn't have chose a better path. So I always tell people, like, try to just open your mind a little bit and don't try to fit into, whatever cannabis box you think is this industry is. Because, especially those of us like, you and I who have been in this for some years now, we understand it's just like any other industry. And there's so many needs. It's not just growing and selling cannabis, it's everything in between, from marketing to sales to insurance to just like anything, promo companies, marketing. So it's, everything is needed in this industry, just like any other industry.
Yeah. A lot of those ancillary companies now, I think, are better paths for most people. And I think it felt very early on. People were starting to, if you were early, right, you could start a dispensary with no retail experience. You start a cultivation with no agricultural experience, but you were a grower in the past, most likely, if you wanted to grow. But now with the oversaturation, the competition, you have to have that extra expertise or It's going to be such a struggle.